Once upon a time, the village of Umuamara had long feared Chief Edward. He was an old man, in his late 70s, with piercing eyes that seemed to see through a person's soul. He had 25 sons and only one daughter, born to him by 4 different wives. Edward was not an ordinary man. He was a ritualist, a man who believed in the darkest traditions, one who would do anything to keep himself alive and powerful. People whispered behind his back, afraid to say his name too loudly. For years, death had followed his family like a shadow. His brother's children never lived long enough to see old age. Whenever Edward's time was near, when sickness weighed him down, a tragedy would strike. One of his nephews would fall ill and die mysteriously. And just like that, Edward would become healthy again, strong as ever. Nobody could prove it, but deep down, they all knew. Then one fateful evening, everything changed. Edward's youngest brother, Patrick, had gone to his farm to check on his crops. As he walked through the tall cassava plants, his foot struck something hard. Curious, he bent down and dug around the spot. His hands trembled as he pulled out a small, wrapped bundle. When he opened it, his heart almost stopped. Inside was a carved wooden doll, tied with red and black threads, with cowries and strange symbols drawn all over it. Patrick's voice shook with fear as he whispered, "This is evil." He knew immediately what it meant. Edward was preparing another blood exchange. Patrick ran back to the village, his feet barely touching the ground. He called for an emergency village meeting, and within minutes, the town square was filled with men, women, and elders. Edward was dragged out of his house. For the first time in his life, he looked afraid. "Edward, is it true?" the village chief asked. "Are you still killing your brother's children to stay alive?" Edward's lips quivered. I don't know what you're talking about." "Liar!" Patrick shouted, throwing the bundle at his feet. "I found this buried in my farm. Do you deny it?" The villagers roared in anger. Some picked up sticks and stones. "You will swear today," one man shouted. "Yes, if you ever harm your brothers or their children again, you will be buried alive." Edward had no choice. He was forced to swear an oath before the village shrine. His hands trembled as he placed them on the sacred stone, knowing the consequences of breaking such a vow. From that day, Edward changed. At least, that was what people thought. He no longer touched his brother's children. But evil cannot leave the heart of a wicked man so easily. He found another way. Instead of using his nephews, he turned to his own children. One night, his household was shaken by loud cries. His eldest son, Daniel, the only university graduate in the family, had collapsed suddenly. His mother screamed, shaking him, "Daniel, open your eyes." She wept, but Daniel was gone. Just like that. Nobody knew who to blame. Edward himself cried the loudest, beating his chest, rolling on the ground like a man who had lost everything. But those who were sharp-eyed noticed something strange. Just a week before Daniel died, Edward had been very sick. He could barely walk. People thought his time had come. Yet, on the morning Daniel died, Edward stepped out of his house looking younger, healthier, stronger. The whispers began again. Something was not right. The whispers spread like harmattan wind, but no one dared to confront Edward. Can he truly do that to his own son? Some asked in hushed voices. "It's not possible." Others replied. "He trained him, sent him to the university. Why would he kill his only educated child?" Doubt crept in. People shook their heads, trying to convince themselves that Edward, despite his dark ways, would never harm his own flesh and blood. Slowly, the rumors faded. Life returned to normal. The villagers went back to their daily activities, pretending as if nothing had happened. But inside Edward's compound, a storm was brewing. Among all his children, there was one who stood out not for strength or power, but because she was different. His only daughter, Olivia. Edward despised her. From the moment his occult brothers warned him never to father a female child. He had tried everything to prevent her birth. When his last wife became pregnant and a seer told him the child would be a girl, he performed several rituals to end the pregnancy. But Olivia was destined for great things. She survived every attempt to erase her existence and came into the world, screaming like a warrior. And from that day, she became his greatest challenge. Unlike his sons, who obeyed him without question, Olivia had a mind of her own. She never hid her dislike for him. If he asked her to fetch water, she would fold her arms and say, "No, I won't." If he told her to sweep the compound, she would shake her head. "Why do you always refuse me?" Edward once asked her, his voice cold with anger. "You are not a good man," Olivia replied fearlessly. "I will not serve you." The first time she said those words, his entire household froze. No one spoke to their father that way. But Olivia was different. She was stubborn, bold, and unshaken by his threats. Edward tried to make her life miserable. He denied her food, hoping she would crawl back and beg, but she found a way to survive, eating from neighbors and kind-hearted villagers who saw the way she was treated. He sent his sons to beat her, but she fought back with a strength no one understood. Even when they overpowered her, she never cried. "She's not normal," his second wife once whispered to him. "Maybe she's protected by something stronger than you." Edward refused to believe it. He tried several times to harm her, using charms, invoking spirits, but nothing worked. No sickness, no accident, no misfortune touched her. She remained untouched, walking around with an air of confidence that made his blood boil. One day, one of his closest friends, an elder in the occult, called him aside. "Let her be," the man warned. "You can't harm her. If you try, she will be the end of you." Edward's face darkened. "No one defies me and lives to tell the story." "You have killed many, Edward," the man said. "But this one, she is different. Let her go, or she will destroy you." But Edward was not a man who listened to warnings. He had spent his entire life bending destiny to his will. He would not stop now. No matter what it took, he would break Olivia, or she would be his downfall. Edward had sworn to make Olivia suffer. If he could not destroy her directly, he would make her life unbearable. One afternoon, Olivia was working in the farm, cutting down weeds with her machete, when she heard a rustling sound behind her. She turned and froze. A massive snake, thick and black, slithered toward her, its tongue flicking in and out. Instead of running, Olivia gripped her machete tighter. The snake lunged at her, but with one swift strike, she cut off its head. Blood splattered on the dry earth as the snake's body twisted before going still. What Olivia didn't know was that her father had sent the snake. Edward had been sitting in his hut, waiting to hear the news that his stubborn daughter was dead. But instead of cries, he heard Olivia's cheerful voice as she returned from the farm, carrying the dead snake over her shoulder. Edward's heart pounded in shock. "Papa, look at what I killed today," Olivia said, dropping the snake in front of him. His face darkened. "Who asked you to bring this into my house?" He snapped. "Stay away from my farm, and stop killing every animals you see on my farmland. I won't warn you again." He didn't want anyone to suspect him. If people found out he was behind the attack, they would question him again. He had sworn before the village not to harm his brother's children, but nobody had said anything about his own. Their hatred for each other grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, while Edward sat outside his house, a group of young men, accompanied by some elders, walked into his compound. He sat up and forced a smile. "You are welcome," he greeted, hiding his curiosity. "What brings you here?" One of the elders cleared his throat. "One of these young men is interested in Olivia," he announced. "He wishes to marry her." Edward raised a brow. "Is that so?" He looked at the young man, who stood with confidence. "Yes, sir," the suitor said. I love Olivia and wish to make her my wife. Edward nodded thoughtfully. No problem, he said, pretending to be pleased. Come back in a week. I will discuss it with Olivia and see if she is ready. The men thanked him and left. But Edward already had his plans. Let her get married, he muttered under his breath. But she won't last long in that marriage. He would make sure of it. But before he could execute his plans, tragedy struck again. The next morning, a loud cry shattered the silence of the compound. Wailing filled the air as people gathered to see what had happened. Edward had lost another son. This one was different. He was the most obedient of all Edward's children, the one he loved the most. He had never questioned his father's ways, never disobeyed him. Edward locked himself in his room and wept bitterly. He clenched his fists and cursed under his breath. I told you not to touch this one, he shouted. Why take my favorite? What happened to the other ones? He had sacrificed too much for his occultic brothers, but this time they had gone too far. Unknown to him, Olivia had been standing outside listening. Then her voice rang through the room, cold and filled with anger. Papa! Edward turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. She stepped forward, her eyes burning with fury. This should be the last time you renew your powers with any of my brothers, she warned. Her voice was steady, firm. Without waiting for a response, she stormed out. Edward stared after her, shaken. Meanwhile, the villagers had begun to whisper again. 2 grown sons, dead in 3 years? What is really happening? Some suspected Edward. Others refused to believe he could harm his own children. But deep down, everyone knew something dark was at play. Weeks after their first visit, the men who had come to ask for Olivia's hand in marriage returned. This time, they were prepared. They brought drinks, money, and gifts for the traditional rites. After her bride price was paid, Olivia followed her new husband home. Her husband, Michael, was a patient and understanding man. He knew Olivia had been raised in a difficult home, so he treated her with care. He never raised his voice at her, never forced her to do anything she didn't want to do. At first, Olivia was distant. She wasn't used to kindness, but over time, she began to relax. She took care of the house, respected Michael, and treated his family with warmth. It didn't take long before they all grew to love her. Months passed, and Olivia remained in her husband's house, happy and peaceful. But back in her father's compound, Edward waited. By now, he had expected Olivia to come running back in disgrace. He had cast a powerful spell on her, a spell meant to drive men away from her. No man was supposed to stand her. No husband was supposed to keep her. Yet, she was still in her husband's house. Edward's anger grew with each passing day. What is going on? He muttered to himself, pacing his hut. Why hasn't she come back? He had used the strongest charms, the ones his occultic brothers had given him. How could they fail? Something wasn't right. Meanwhile, in Olivia's home, life went on smoothly. One evening, after dinner, Michael called Olivia inside. He sat on the edge of their wooden bed, watching her as she arranged the room. Come, sit with me, he said gently. She walked over and sat beside him. For a moment, he was silent, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he spoke. Olivia, you know we have been married for months now, he began, and I know I haven't touched you yet. She nodded. Yes, I noticed. Michael reached for her hands. The reason is because I knew you were a virgin. I wanted to give you time, so you wouldn't feel pressured. Olivia's heart warmed. She had never known a man could be this patient. Thank you, she said, smiling, but I'm ready now. Michael smiled back and kissed her forehead. He blew out the oil lamp beside them, letting the soft moonlight filter through the small window. As they moved closer, Michael's fingers brushed against her lower body. He suddenly stopped. His entire body went rigid. His breath hitched. His hands trembled. Confused, Olivia looked at him. "What's wrong?" Michael didn't answer. His eyes were fixed below her waist, his face frozen in shock. He swallowed hard and tried to speak, but his voice barely came out. "Olivia, what? What is this?" She frowned. "What are you talking about?" With shaky hands, he reached for her again, this time more carefully. He felt it again. His heart pounded. Michael jumped off the bed as though he had touched fire. "Olivia." His voice was barely above a whisper. You have a..." He couldn't even finish the sentence. Olivia's chest tightened. She looked down at herself, and then her blood ran cold. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands trembled. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Michael's face was pale. "Olivia, why do you have a male reproductive organ?" A heavy silence filled the room. Olivia's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her heartbeat thundered. Sweat formed on her forehead. Michael staggered backward, his face filled with disbelief. What was happening? Olivia was terrified. Her entire body shook as she clutched the bedsheet beneath her. Just moments ago, she had been a woman normal, just like every other woman she knew. But now, staring down at herself, she saw something that shouldn't be there. Her breathing became heavy. Her heart pounded. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she lifted her hands to her head. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael stood frozen, his face pale as if he had just seen a ghost. His lips parted, but no words came out. He kept blinking, as if hoping his eyes were deceiving him. "Olivia," he finally managed to say. What is this?" Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes. She quickly grabbed his hands and held them tightly. "Michael, please. You have to believe me. I don't know what's happening to me. I swear. I have never seen this before in my life." Her voice cracked as she spoke. Michael took a shaky breath, trying to process the situation. Olivia's grip tightened around his hands. "Please, don't tell anyone," she pleaded. "Let this be our secret. I don't understand what's happening, but I will find a solution. Just don't let anyone know." Michael swallowed hard. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the genuine fear that consumed her. He knew Olivia, she was a kind woman, well-mannered, and full of respect. Whatever was happening to her, she didn't deserve it. Slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "I won't tell anyone." A small sob escaped Olivia's lips. She wiped her tears quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples. "Let's just act like nothing happened," he said. "Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe our eyes were playing tricks on us." Olivia nodded, even though deep down, she wasn't convinced. She stood up, adjusted her wrapper, and walked back to her room. But just as she entered, something strange happened. She felt lighter. The heaviness that had suddenly appeared between her legs was gone. Confused, she looked down at herself. Her eyes widened. It was gone. The thing that had scared her just moments ago had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. She gasped and ran her hands over her body. "It's really gone," she whispered in shock. She touched herself over and over again, trying to be sure. A smile broke out on her face. Without wasting another second, she ran back to Michael's room, flinging the door open. "Michael," she called, excitement in her voice. Michael, who had been deep in thought, quickly turned to face her. "What is it?" he asked, standing up. Without saying a word, Olivia untied her wrapper and let it fall to the ground. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing at herself. Michael's eyes widened. He slowly walked toward her, carefully inspecting her body. His brows furrowed as he crouched down slightly, double-checking to make sure he wasn't seeing things. His eyes met hers in astonishment. "It's gone," he asked. Yes, Olivia cried out. It's gone. Whatever it was, it disappeared the moment I left your room. Michael let out a deep breath of relief and pulled her into a hug. Maybe we imagined it, he said, stroking her back gently. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Olivia held onto him tightly. I hope so, she murmured against his chest. Michael pulled away slightly, cupped her face and smiled. Don't be scared. Whatever happened, it's over now. She nodded, feeling safer in his arms. Just as she was about to step away, Michael gently traced his fingers along her arms, his touch warm and reassuring. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Stay with me tonight, he whispered. Olivia hesitated for a moment. She was still shaken by what had happened, but Michael's presence made her feel calm. She nodded. Okay. Michael smiled and pulled her back toward the bed. He wrapped his arms around her as they sat down together. Slowly, he began to touch her, his hands moving carefully as if trying to make her feel comfortable. Olivia closed her eyes, allowing herself to enjoy the warmth of his embrace. But just as the moment grew more intense, just as Michael was about to fully claim his wife, he suddenly froze. His entire body stiffened. His breathing hitched. His eyes widened in horror. No, he breathed, his voice trembling. Olivia's eyes snapped open. She didn't need to ask why he had stopped. She already knew. Michael pulled away from her as if he had been burned. He scrambled backward, almost falling off the bed. Olivia, he choked. His voice was laced with shock and fear. Olivia's heart sank. Slowly, she looked down at herself, and there it was. The thing she thought had disappeared had returned. Her blood ran cold. Her hands flew to her mouth. She shook her head violently. No, 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 she cried. Tears streamed down her face as she collapsed onto the bed, sobbing. Why is this happening to me? She wailed. Michael ran his hands through his hair, his breathing uneven. This is not normal, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia curled up into a ball, shaking uncontrollably. Michael hesitated, then slowly reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. Listen to me, he said firmly. No matter what is happening, you're still my wife. She sniffled and looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. I promise you, Michael continued, we will find a way to fix this. But for now, no one else can know about this. If people hear about it, they will not understand. They will judge you. They will call you names. Olivia wiped her tears, nodding weakly. Do you trust me? Michael asked. She hesitated, then nodded again. Yes, she whispered. Michael sighed and gently pulled her into his arms. Then don't be afraid, he murmured. We will get through this together. But as Olivia buried her face in his chest, one thought kept running through her mind. Was this truly something they could overcome? Or was it just the beginning of something far worse? Michael sat on the edge of his bed, his hands gripping his forehead. His thoughts were all over the place. He loved Olivia, but how could he continue living like this? This strange and terrifying thing was beyond his understanding. He let out a deep sigh and turned to Olivia, who sat across from him with her face buried in her hands. Olivia, he said gently, you should go back to your room. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. Why? She whispered. Michael swallowed hard. Because the last time this happened, it disappeared when you were alone. Maybe it will go away again. Olivia wiped her tears and nodded slowly. Without another word, she stood up and walked out of the room, her legs feeling weak beneath her. When she entered her room, she closed the door behind her and sat on the bed. She was too afraid to check, but she forced herself to. She lifted her wrapper and looked down at herself. It was gone. Just like before, the strange thing had disappeared. She exhaled sharply and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Weeks passed. Michael and Olivia tried to act normal. They avoided talking about what had happened and went about their daily activities as if nothing was wrong. But deep down, both of them knew the truth: this thing was not going away. One evening, Michael sat in the living room, tapping his fingers on the wooden table. He had been thinking about it for days, and finally, he made up his mind. "Olivia," he called. She walked into the room, looking at him with hopeful eyes. "Yes?" Michael hesitated. He didn't want to hurt her, but he had to say it. "I think we should try again," he said. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. "Try what?" Michael looked at her. "Being together, like husband and wife," he said softly. Maybe it won't happen again." Olivia's hands trembled. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but a part of her wanted to believe that whatever was happening to her was over. She nodded slowly. "Okay, let's try." That night, Olivia lay beside Michael, her heart pounding in her chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to relax. Michael kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her lips. She kissed him back, trying to push away the fear that threatened to consume her. Everything seemed fine until it wasn't. Just as Michael was about to claim his wife, he froze. His hands stiffened against her skin. His breathing became ragged. His body trembled. "No," he muttered under his breath. Olivia's eyes snapped open. She knew. She didn't even need to check. Michael slowly pulled away from her, his face twisted in horror. "It happened again," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tears spilled from Olivia's eyes as she sat up, wrapping her arms around herself. She sobbed quietly, feeling ashamed, confused, and helpless. Michael clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't keep this to himself anymore. He had to talk to someone. The next morning, Michael made a decision. He left the house and traveled to see his father's brother, Uncle Joseph. When he arrived, his uncle was sitting outside, sipping palm wine. He looked up and smiled. "Michael, my son, what brings you here?" Michael sat down, his face serious. "Uncle, I have a problem," he said. Uncle Joseph set down his cup. "What is it?" Michael hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. "It's Olivia," he said. "Something strange is happening to her." Uncle Joseph frowned. "What do you mean?" Michael took a deep breath. She has a penis," he said in a shaky voice. His uncle's eyes widened in shock. "What?" Michael nodded. "It comes and goes. When she's alone, it disappears. But when we try to be together as husband and wife, it comes back." Uncle Joseph shook his head. "This is not ordinary," he said firmly. "It is a taboo for a woman to have such a thing. If the villagers find out, they will stone her to death." Michael's stomach twisted. "What should I do, Uncle?" Uncle Joseph leaned closer. "You must return her to her people," he said. "Take her back before this thing brings shame to our family." Michael's heart broke. He loved Olivia, but how could he live like this? Could he really stay with her, knowing she was not a normal woman? He sighed deeply. "I will do it," he said. "Tomorrow, I will take her back to her father." That evening, when he got home, Olivia was waiting for him. "Where did you go?" she asked softly. Michael sat down and looked at her, his expression unreadable. He took her hands in his grip firm but gentle. "Olivia," he said, "I need to tell you something." Her heart pounded. "What is it?" Michael took a deep breath. "I have to return you to your people." Olivia's eyes widened. "What?" "It's a taboo for a woman to go through what you're going through," he continued. "If the villagers find out, they will not spare you. I love you, but I can't be with you anymore." Tears filled Olivia's eyes. "Michael, please don't do this," she whispered. Michael looked away, his jaw clenched. "Tomorrow, I and my family will take you back to your father," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. Olivia sobbed, but there was nothing she could do. The next day, Olivia was escorted back to her village. She sat in silence as Michael, his uncle, and some other elders from his family walked beside her. When they arrived at her father's compound, Chief Edward was already waiting for them. He smiled when he saw them, but quickly replaced his expression with one of concern. "Michael, my son," he said, What brings you here? Michael hesitated, then spoke. We are here to return Olivia, he said. She is not a normal woman. She has a penis, and we cannot keep such a person as a wife in our family. Chief Edward gasped, pretending to be shocked. What? That is impossible. Michael nodded. It is true. We have come to return her, and we ask that you return the bride price we paid for her. Olivia stood quietly, tears streaming down her face. Some villagers had already gathered, whispering among themselves. Chief Edward sighed and shook his head. This is unfortunate, he said, but if that is the case, I will not force her upon you. Here is your bride price. Michael collected the money and left with his people, not once looking back at Olivia. As soon as they were gone, Chief Edward let out a loud, wicked laugh. This is just the beginning, he said, staring at Olivia. I will deal with you properly. Olivia's heart pounded as she looked at her father. Was he responsible for her suffering? Olivia sat on the wooden bench outside her hut, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't silence. So, my father is the one behind all this? She had suspected it before, but the way he reacted when she returned home confirmed everything. He had laughed at her pain. He had mocked her as if he knew exactly what was happening. That evil man must have cast a spell on me. That is why I grow a penis whenever I am with a man. Her heart burned with anger, but she knew she had to be careful. Edward was not just her father. He was a man known for his deep involvement in dark rituals. If she rushed into accusing him, he might turn the entire village against her. I must find a way to expose him. He must confess, and I will not stop until I bring him down. But there was a bigger problem. Everyone in the village now knew about her strange condition. Since the day Michael and his people returned her, rumors had spread like wildfire. People whispered when she passed. Some stared at her with fear, others with disgust. She had become an outcast overnight. She barely left her hut anymore. She couldn't bear the humiliation. One evening, as she sat deep in thought, a sudden idea flashed in her mind. I will make him confess. There must be a way to force him to admit what he has done. She quickly rose to her feet, determination blazing in her eyes. Just as she stepped out of her hut, a woman from the village rushed towards her. Olivia! Olivia! The woman called, panting. Olivia turned sharply. What is it? She asked. Your father, Chief Edward. He is very sick. They say he might not live through the night. Olivia's lips slowly curled into a smile. Finally, the gods are punishing him. She nodded and muttered under her breath. Then I will not confront him anymore. Let him die on his own. She turned back into her hut and shut the door behind her. For the next few days, Olivia remained indoors, waiting to hear the news of her father's death. Each time she heard footsteps outside, she expected someone to announce his passing, but the news never came. Then, one evening, a loud wail echoed through the village. She rushed outside and saw people running towards the stream. Her heart pounded in her chest. What happened? She asked one of the women rushing past. It's your brother, the woman cried. He went to fetch water and was bitten by a snake. He slumped and died immediately. Olivia's heart stopped. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to run to the stream. By the time she got there, a small crowd had gathered. Her younger brother's body lay still on the ground, his skin pale, his eyes lifeless. Olivia let out a scream and fell to her knees. No, no, not my brother. Tears streamed down her face as she rocked back and forth. She had lost a brother before, and now it was happening again. The villagers sobbed, shaking their heads in sorrow. But then, a murmur spread through the crowd. Wait, wasn't Chief Edward sick? Someone whispered. Yes, he was almost dying, another answered. Then why is he standing there, looking healthy and strong? She rose to her feet and pushed through the crowd, stepping closer to him. Chief Edward stood still, watching the scene without a single tear in his eyes. Olivia stopped a few steps away from him. She studied his face, searching for even the smallest trace of sorrow. But there was none. He was not grieving. He was not mourning. He was just standing there watching. That was when Olivia knew without a doubt that her father was a monster. The air was thick with sorrow as Olivia stood over her brother's lifeless body. Her heart ached, but her rage was stronger. She clenched her fists, her breath shaky. "Please," she turned to the men standing nearby, "help me carry my brother home." A few villagers stepped forward to lift the corpse, but just as they bent down, Olivia's voice rang out. "Stop!" she commanded. The men froze. The crowd that had gathered around them fell silent, all eyes on Olivia. "I know who killed my brother," she said, her voice filled with pain but steady with conviction. She pointed a trembling finger at her father. It was no one else but Chief Edward. Gasps echoed through the crowd, though everyone had suspected it. Hearing Olivia say it aloud made the reality even heavier. People exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. "We all know she's telling the truth," an elderly woman finally said, shaking her head. "That man was almost dying just a few days ago. How is he suddenly strong again?" "In our village," another man spoke, "when someone is suspected of murder and the victim has not yet been buried, the suspect must carry the corpse home. If they are truly guilty, they will die the next day." A murmur of agreement swept through the villagers. "Let Chief Edward carry his son's body," a young man shouted. "Yes," another woman added, "since he has refused to die, let him carry and even roast the corpse for himself. A man who renews his life with the blood of his children." An old man muttered bitterly. The villagers turned to Edward, their eyes filled with disgust and anger. Olivia stepped forward, her eyes locking onto her father's. "You must carry him home," she said, her voice firm. "Days ago, you were too weak to walk. How are you suddenly strong enough to stand here? Prove you had no hand in this. Carry your son's body." The people stepped aside, forming a path for Edward. He said nothing. Without protest, he bent down, lifted his son's lifeless body onto his head, and began walking toward their home. The villagers followed behind him, chanting and shouting. Some picked up leaves and sticks, striking him whenever he slowed down. "Move!" someone barked. "Let the blood of your own son weigh you down." Another cursed. With each step, his breath grew heavier, but he did not complain. He carried the body like a man accepting his fate. By the time he reached their compound, his clothes were soaked in sweat. He slowly lowered his son's body onto the ground, straightened up, and faced the villagers. His face was blank, unreadable. "If truly I am the one who killed my son," he declared, his voice calm, "by this time tomorrow, I will be dead." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people shook their heads, others crossed their arms, waiting to see what would happen next. Without another word, Edward turned and walked into his hut. The door creaked shut behind him. Inside, the dimly lit room was filled with the scent of burning herbs. He sat on the wooden floor. Then suddenly he laughed. A deep, satisfied laugh. The kind of laughter a man would have after winning a great battle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cola nut he had been chewing throughout the walk home. He turned it in his palm, a smirk playing on his lips. Fools! His occultic brothers had warned him about this moment. They told him that Olivia and the villagers would force him to carry his son's body. "Do not resist," they had told him. "Do exactly as they say. But as you carry the body, chew a cola nut. If you do this, the spirit of the dead will have no power to take your life." And that was exactly what he had done. Outside, Olivia and the others buried her brother. She cried, her body trembling as she threw a handful of sand over his grave. She wanted justice. She wanted revenge. But now, her brother was gone, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. The next morning, the entire village gathered near Chief Edward's hut. They were waiting to hear the news that he had died in his sleep. People whispered among themselves, some checking the time repeatedly. Then, suddenly, the door to Edward's hut creaked open. A figure stepped out. It was him, still alive, still standing. Gasps filled the air. Olivia felt her knees weaken. "No, this is not possible," she whispered, shaking her head. Some villagers ran to his hut, expecting to find his lifeless body inside. But there was nothing. "He is still alive," someone shouted. But But how? Another stammered. Unknown to them, Edward had outsmarted them. The ritual had worked. He was safe. Olivia's heart sank. She had been so sure that justice would come, that the gods would strike him down. But now, doubt crept into her mind. What if we were wrong? What if he didn't kill my brother? Or what if he is simply untouchable? She stared at her father as he stood there, watching them with his cold, dark eyes. And for the first time in her life, Olivia felt fear. Olivia's heart was heavy with frustration. She had spent weeks traveling from one village to another, visiting every herbalist, seer, and spiritualist she could find, desperately seeking a solution to her problem. Each time, she explained her condition, hoping for an answer, but none of them could help her. "I'm sorry, my daughter," one elderly herbalist had said, shaking his head. "This is beyond my knowledge." Another had simply stared into his bowl of water, muttering incantations before sighing in defeat. "I see great darkness around you," he said. "Only the one who cast this upon you can undo it." The words echoed in Olivia's mind as she walked toward yet another spiritualist's house. She was tired, but she couldn't stop now. This was her last hope. As she stepped into the compound, an old man sitting on a wooden stool under a mango tree looked up. His piercing eyes met hers, and before she could introduce herself, he spoke. "Olivia, I have been expecting you," he said, a small smile on his face. Her heart skipped a beat. How does he know my name? She hadn't told anyone in this village about her visit. Her steps faltered, and she glanced around nervously. "Come and sit," the man said, pointing to a small wooden bench beside him. Still shocked, she hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The man studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Your birth brought great misfortune to your father." Olivia frowned. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward. "Before you were born, your father was warned never to have a daughter. He was chosen to lead his occultic brothers. But the moment you were born, he lost his position." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "From that moment," the man continued, "he saw you as a curse. He blamed you for his downfall. And in his anger, he placed a terrible spell on you." Her hands trembled in her lap. "What kind of spell?" "He vowed that no man would ever marry you and that you would never bear children." A lump formed in Olivia's throat. She had always wondered why no relationship ever worked out for her. Why every time she tried to love, something strange would happen. And now, she finally had an answer. Tears welled in her eyes. "So, is there no solution?" The man's eyes softened. "There is good news, Olivia," he said. She swallowed hard, waiting. "As you go home today, my son will follow you. He has been waiting for you. He is your husband." Olivia's eyes widened in shock. "Your son?" she whispered. "Yes." The man nodded. "You were meant to be together." Olivia's mind raced. Could this really be happening? She wasn't getting any younger, and after all the rejection and pain, the thought of finally having a husband made her heart swell with hope. But then, a thought crossed her mind, and doubt crept in. "Will this change everything?" she asked hesitantly. The man's face darkened slightly. He looked up at the sky as if choosing his words carefully. "I cannot tell you that," he finally said. "Your father is watching you right now." A shiver ran down Olivia's spine. "He sees you through his mirror," the man continued. "If I say too much, he will try to stop you." She swallowed hard, fear creeping into her chest. The old man reached out and touched her hand gently. "Do not be afraid. I will instruct my son on what to do. The moment you reach the entrance of your compound, he will take action." Olivia's heart pounded. "And then what?" The man's lips curled into a small smile. "Your father will die on the day you have a proper wedding." A heavy silence followed his words. Olivia's chest rose and fell rapidly as she tried to process everything. Her father had caused her so much pain. He had cursed her life, stolen her happiness, and destroyed everything good for her. And now, his end was near. She slowly exhaled and nodded. "Then let's go," she said. The spiritualist turned to the small hut beside him and called out, "Come in, my son." A few seconds later, A tall and well-built young man stepped into the room. His dark skin glowed under the dim light, and his strong features made Olivia's heart skip a beat. He had broad shoulders and a confident walk, yet his face carried a calmness that put her at ease. The spiritualist smiled as the young man stood before them. "My son, this is the woman you have been waiting for," he said, gesturing toward Olivia. "Her name is Olivia." The young man's eyes met Olivia's, and in that moment, she felt something stir within her. He was even more handsome than she had imagined. His muscles were well defined, and his presence was strong. He gave a small bow and greeted her politely. "It's nice to meet you, Olivia." Olivia felt her cheeks warm. "Nice to meet you too." She had been through so much pain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Just as they were about to step outside, the spiritualist called his son back. He reached behind him and picked up a small leather bag, handing it over carefully. "Take this with you," he instructed. "Inside are the things you will need. When you reach Olivia's home, follow my instructions exactly. And when you meet her father, tell him that your family will come soon with a final date for the wedding." The young man nodded and took the bag. "I understand, father." With that, he turned to Olivia and gently took her hand. His grip was warm and firm. "Let's go," he said. As they walked together, Olivia felt an unusual sense of safety. It was as if she had known him forever. He turned to her and smiled. "You have no idea how long I have waited for this day." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Every time I brought a woman home, my father would shake his head and tell me no. Your wife is not from this village. It happened so many times that I almost lost hope." He chuckled softly. Olivia smiled. "And now," he squeezed her hand slightly. "Now, I know he was right all along." A warm feeling spread through Olivia's chest. As they continued their walk, she found herself telling him everything, how her father had cursed her, how she had suffered, and how she had tried to find a solution. He listened patiently, nodding as she spoke. "You have been through so much," he said, "but I promise from today, you won't suffer alone." They continued their conversation, sharing stories about their pasts, and with each passing moment, Olivia felt herself connecting more with him. When they finally reached the entrance of Olivia's compound, the young man stopped. "Is this the only entrance to your father's house?" he asked. Olivia nodded. "Yes, this is the only way in." Without another word, he opened the leather bag his father had given him. Olivia watched as he carefully pulled out 3 small eggs. "What are you doing?" she asked, feeling slightly nervous. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and smashed the first egg on the ground. The moment it hit the floor, a strange smoke began to rise. Olivia's eyes widened in fear. He quickly smashed the second and third eggs, and the smoke thickened, forming a small cloud above the ground. Olivia's heart pounded. She took a step back, ready to run, but he gently grabbed her hand. "Don't move," he whispered. "It's almost done." She swallowed hard and stood still, watching as he bent down and dug into the earth with his bare hands. After a few moments, he pulled something out of the ground, a small bundle wrapped in black cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, and Olivia gasped when she saw what was inside. It was an old, faded picture of her, tied together with strange-looking carries and dried leaves. "What is this?" she whispered. He looked up at her. "This is how your father has been controlling you. This charm was buried here to keep him connected to you. That's why he always knew your every move." Olivia felt chills run down her spine. "But now," he said, standing up, "he has lost his power over you." She stared at him in disbelief. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "From today, he will not be able to watch you through his mirror anymore." Olivia felt tears sting her eyes. She had spent her whole life under her father's shadow, trapped by his evil ways. But now, for the first time, she was free. She wiped her face quickly and smiled at him. "Thank you." He returned her smile and gently wiped the dirt off his hands. "Come on," he said. "Let's go inside." Hand in hand, they stepped into the compound, ready for whatever lay ahead. As they stepped into the compound, Olivia and her suitor greeted everyone politely. The air was tense, and curious eyes followed them as they made their way inside. Olivia quickly pulled out a wooden chair and gestured for him to sit. "Please, have a seat," she said with a small smile. The young man nodded and sat down, his posture calm and confident. Olivia, however, could feel the weight of the moment. She knew her father would not take this lightly. A few moments later, Chief Edward emerged from his hut. His expression was dark, his lips pressed into a firm line. He stood in the center of the compound, his piercing eyes locked onto the stranger. Olivia felt her heart race, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her suitor stood up and greeted him respectfully. "Good evening, Chief Edward," he said, his voice steady. Edward did not return the greeting. Instead, he crossed his arms and stared at him suspiciously. "Who are you? And what do you want in my house?" he asked coldly. The young man did not waver. "My name is Daniel," he said. "I have come to ask for Olivia's hand in marriage." The moment those words left his mouth, the entire compound fell silent. Olivia held her breath, waiting for her father's reaction. Edward let out a dry laugh and shook his head. Without hesitation, "You ask for her hand?" he sneered. "Don't you know she has a penis?" Gasps rippled through the small crowd of onlookers. Olivia clenched her fists. How many times would her father humiliate her like this? But Daniel did not flinch. He kept his gaze steady and replied, "I know." Edward's eyes narrowed. "You know, and you still want to be with a man like you?" His voice was laced with disbelief. Daniel nodded. "Yes, because I love her," he said simply, "and my people will follow me when I return for the final wedding arrangements." A lump formed in Olivia's throat. Someone was standing up for her for the first time in her life. A man was not ashamed of her. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she quickly wiped them away. Edward studied Daniel for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Then, to everyone's surprise, he scoffed and said, "Fine. You can marry her." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, dismissing them as if they were nothing. Olivia's heart swelled with joy. She turned to Daniel, smiling brightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You deserve to be happy, Olivia." While the rest of the family and villagers whispered among themselves, Edward stormed into his hut. He slammed the door shut and began pacing the floor in frustration. "How?" he muttered under his breath. "How did I not see this young man coming? How was I unable to know Olivia had met someone?" His heart pounded in his chest. He had always known what Olivia was doing, who she was meeting, and where she was going. But this time, he had been completely blind to it. Something was wrong. He rushed to the corner of his room, where a large mirror stood against the wall. It was no ordinary mirror, it was his source of power, the tool he used to monitor Olivia's every move. Taking a deep breath, he waved his hand over the glass, chanting under his breath. The surface of the mirror shimmered, swirling like water. But when he looked into it, Olivia was not there. His eyes widened in shock. "No, this cannot be," he whispered. He waved his hand again, muttering stronger incantations. Still, the mirror remained blank. Olivia had disappeared from his sight. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. What is happening? For the first time in years, fear crept into his heart. His control over Olivia had been severed. Someone had broken his power over her. His hands clenched into fists. "I need to act fast before it's too late," he growled. Chief Edward had never been afraid of anything before, but now he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: powerless. Chief Edward sat in his dimly lit hut, his mind troubled. He could no longer see Olivia in his mirror, and it made him uneasy. His control over her had slipped away, and he needed answers. Without wasting time, he summoned some of his cult members. When they arrived, they sat in a circle around him, their faces stern. The air was heavy with tension as Edward cleared his throat. "I called you here because something strange has happened," he said. "I can no longer see Olivia in my mirror, but she is still here, alive and well." Someone has blocked my powers. The men exchanged glances before one of them, a tall man with deep scars on his arms, spoke. "Show us the mirror," he demanded. Edward wasted no time. He picked up the mirror from the corner of the room and turned it towards them. As soon as they looked into it, Olivia's reflection appeared clearly. "But she's right there," one of them pointed out. Edward frowned. He turned the mirror towards himself, but to his shock, her reflection vanished. Confused, he flipped it back towards his members, and Olivia's image returned. "You see?" he asked, his voice shaking. "When I look into it, she disappears." One of the men scoffed. "Maybe you have an eye problem, Chief Edward. We don't know what you're talking about. We can all see her just fine." Another one shook his head in disappointment. "If this is the reason you called us here, please don't do it again. We have more important things to attend to." With that, they stood up and left, leaving Edward alone with his fears. From that day on, Edward's fear of Olivia grew. He could no longer track her movements, and it unsettled him deeply. Each time he saw her, a cold chill ran down his spine. Something had changed, and he could feel it. Weeks later, time passed quickly, and before Edward knew it, the day of Olivia's wedding had arrived. Daniel returned with his people, and they came in a grand way. A long line of men and women dressed in rich fabrics walked into the village, carrying gifts of all kinds. Drummers played loudly, announcing their arrival. The villagers gathered in numbers, watching in amazement. "This is the biggest wedding we have ever seen," one woman whispered to her friend. "Indeed," the friend replied. "Who would have thought Olivia's wedding would be this grand?" Chief Edward stood at the entrance of his compound, watching in shock. He had never expected this. He had thought Daniel would come with just a few people, not an entire parade of wealth and power. When Daniel's father approached, Edward stretched out his hand for a handshake. The moment their hands touched, Edward felt a strange sensation rush through his body. His eyes widened, his breathing became unsteady, and his hands trembled slightly. What was that? He thought, trying to shake off the feeling. The wedding ceremony began, filled with joy and laughter. Women danced with colorful wrappers tied around their waists, while men clapped and cheered. The air smelled of delicious food, and children ran around excitedly. As Olivia twirled in her wedding attire, she suddenly noticed something unusual. In the sky, several owls were circling above the compound. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that owls were not ordinary birds in her village. They were often linked to dark powers. She glanced at Daniel, who had also seen them. He gave her a reassuring nod. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "Nothing will happen to you. I will protect you." Before she could respond, a loud, terrifying cry pierced through the celebration. "Ah!" Everyone froze. The drumming stopped. The dancing halted. All heads turned towards the source of the scream. It was Chief Edward. Chief Edward suddenly fell to the ground, screaming in terror. His body shook, and sweat poured down his face as he stretched out his hands as if begging for mercy. Please don't kill me," he cried out. I will confess everything." The entire crowd gathered around him, watching in shock. No one had touched him, yet he was acting as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. Daniel stepped forward and spoke calmly. "Confess then. Say everything you have done." Edward gasped for air and began to speak. "I destroyed Olivia's life. Right from birth, I hated her. She was not supposed to be born, but her mother refused to get rid of her, and I hated her for it." He clutched his chest and continued. "I was meant to become the leader of my occultic group, but they warned me if I ever fathered a girl, I would lose my position. When Olivia was born, I was cast out and humiliated." Gasps filled the air as the villagers whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disgust, while others covered their mouths in shock. "But I could not just sit back and do nothing," Edward continued. "I cursed her. I made sure no man would marry her. I planted charms in the ground so that no matter where she went, she would always suffer. I even placed her under a mirror spell so I could monitor her every move. I wanted her to die miserable and alone." Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes, but she remained silent. Edward turned to her and fell on his knees, his face filled with regret. "Forgive me, Olivia. I beg you. Please forgive me. I did everything out of anger, but I now see that I was wrong. Please, my daughter, have mercy on me." Olivia looked at him, but she said nothing. Suddenly, Edward let out another piercing scream. His body shook violently, and he clutched his throat as though something was choking him. "No, please, don't take me," he shrieked. His eyes bulged and his body convulsed before he suddenly collapsed. Silence fell over the crowd. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, someone from the back of the crowd shouted, "He's dead." A wave of murmurs and screams spread through the village. Women covered their heads, and men stepped back in fear. Before anyone could react, the owls that had been flying around earlier swooped down and landed on Edward's lifeless body. The people watched in horror as the birds started picking at his flesh. "Ah, what is this?" a woman screamed. "This is not normal." An elderly man whispered. Olivia, fighting back the emotions rising in her chest, turned to a group of young men. "Please, help me dig his grave. We must bury him." The young men stepped forward, but just as they bent down to begin digging, something strange happened. The owls that had been feeding on Edward's body suddenly grew larger, their bodies stretching unnaturally. Before the eyes of the terrified villagers, the birds transformed into tall, muscular men dressed in black suits. Their faces were cold, their eyes dark and lifeless. One of the men stepped forward and spoke in a deep, commanding voice. "You cannot bury him." Everyone stood frozen. "He is our member," another one added. "His body belongs to us. He made a pact with us long ago, and now we have come to claim what is ours." Their presence sent chills through the crowd. The villagers stepped back, terrified. Olivia took a deep breath and nodded. "Take him then. After all, he was never really my father. A true father would never do what he did to me." The men in suits bent down, picked up Edward's body, and without another word, they vanished into thin air, disappearing like smoke into the wind. Gasps of fear and awe filled the air. The villagers crossed themselves, whispering prayers under their breath. Olivia stood still for a moment, staring at the empty spot where her father's body had been. Then, overwhelmed with emotions, she turned to Daniel and buried her face in his chest. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "Why do I feel sad, even after everything he did to me?" Daniel wrapped his arms around her and stroked her back gently. "Because no matter what, he was still your father. It is okay to feel this way. But you're free now, Olivia. He can never hurt you again." She nodded slowly and wiped her tears. Despite everything that had just happened, the villagers knew one thing. Olivia's wedding was not going to be ruined by Edward's sins. The drummers picked up their instruments again. The women resumed their dancing, and soon, the celebration continued in full force. Laughter and joy filled the air as Olivia and Daniel's wedding went on in grand style. The people feasted and danced, celebrating not just their union, but also Olivia's freedom from the chains of her past. Later that night, after all the festivities, Daniel and Olivia finally returned to his home. By the time they arrived, exhaustion had taken over. Olivia could barely keep her eyes open as she removed her shoes. Daniel smiled at her. "You must be tired." She yawned and nodded. "Yes, today was a lot." He chuckled softly. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we start our new life together." Olivia smiled as she climbed into bed beside him. "I like the sound of that." Within minutes, they both drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep, their past behind them and their future ahead. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Birds chirped outside, and a soft breeze rustled the curtains. Olivia slowly opened her eyes, feeling a deep sense of peace that she had never known before. She turned her head and saw Daniel beside her, watching her with a gentle smile. "Good morning, my love," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She smiled back. "Good morning." He leaned closer and kissed her forehead, then her cheeks. His touch was warm and loving, sending shivers down her spine. Slowly, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Olivia felt safe in his embrace, a feeling she had longed for all her life. As their bodies pressed together, Olivia felt something different, something she had never felt before. A realization dawned on her, and she pulled back slightly, her heart racing. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice filled with surprise. He looked at her with concern. "What is it?" She took a deep breath and touched her body. "Something is different. I didn't develop anything today." Daniel's eyes widened in shock. "Are you sure?" She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, it's gone. I'm normal." For a moment, they stared at each other, overwhelmed with emotion. Then, Daniel cupped her face and kissed her deeply. "The storm is truly over," he murmured against her lips. Olivia let herself melt into his touch, allowing Daniel to fully claim her heart, body, and soul. She had finally been set free from the darkness that had once controlled her life. A few weeks later, Olivia stood in front of the small wooden mirror in their bedroom, her hands gently placed over her stomach. She smiled as she felt the tiny life growing inside her. Daniel walked in and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. "How is my queen feeling today?" he asked softly. She leaned into his embrace. "I feel wonderful." His hands moved to her stomach, and he grinned. "And our little one?" Olivia giggled. "Growing well and strong." Daniel placed a gentle kiss on her neck. "I can't wait to meet her or him." 9 months later, the entire household was filled with excitement. Women gathered around Olivia, fanning her as she lay on the bed, breathing heavily. The midwife gave her encouraging words, while Daniel paced outside, his heart pounding with nervousness. After hours of labor, a loud cry filled the air. The midwife held up a beautiful baby girl, her tiny hands waving in the air. "It's a girl," the midwife announced. Tears streamed down Olivia's face as she held her daughter for the first time. "She's perfect," she whispered. Daniel rushed in and knelt beside the bed, staring at his daughter in awe. "She's so beautiful," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. Olivia smiled and looked at him. "She's our miracle." Daniel kissed her forehead. "Thank you, my love. Thank you for giving me the greatest gift." The room was filled with joy and laughter. Olivia, once rejected and cursed, had found love, happiness, and a family of her own. Please, tell me how you feel about this story. This story has been a journey of pain, love, and redemption. Olivia's struggles show us that no matter how hard life gets, there is always hope. Lessons from this story. No matter how much people try to destroy you, they can never stop your destiny. Love will always win over hate. Evil may seem powerful, but in the end, it always destroys itself. Never stop believing in yourself, even when others reject you. Family is not about blood, it is about love, kindness, and those who stand by you. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.